We are trying something a little bit different this week. I'm actually going to be recording my palette. This is real time, it's a short one, but I thought, we'll do added bonus and record the palette at the same time. This project would be great if you have not painted with acrylics or you just want a quick project to do. Also great if you need a quick Christmas gift to give to somebody. This one would be great. You guys are welcome to copy this exactly if you want. It's a pretty basic design. I am working on a Frederick's watercolor canvas board. The watercolor canvas boards are great especially if it's something you're giving to somebody as a gift. It's not as expensive as a regular canvas, but they are so smooth that it makes it very easy to get really smooth detail, smooth blending. It's just a really nice canvas to work on if you're working in realism where you do have a lot of detail and you do want your blending to be smooth. If you're working on a canvas that is rougher, it has a lot of tooth, the paint just catches in it. It doesn't really come out as smooth as you would like. So here I'm taking this brush. I have mixed a little bit of water in with my paint. The question that I get all the time is it okay to use water in with your acrylic paints? There's a video on YouTube that tells you it's basically the end of the world. It's not. It's fine. I will have a link to my video explaining why it's okay and things to watch out for. That'll be in the video description. So the colors that I have used here, I am using my titanium white mixed with orange. I've got a little bit of yellow for that center color. I blocked that on. Now this is a small canvas, so it's really easy to paint fast enough that the paint is not drying on you. So I'm not really having to sit here and airbrush water to keep it wet. I think if you are somebody who is just wanting to get started with acrylic and don't want to mess with all of the different ways to keep the canvas wet, this is a good one for you to get started with. Because if your brush strokes show on this, it really doesn't matter anyway. Now this magenta color, I mixed that by using my Dioxazine Purple with some red. And I'm blending that out with the mop brush. With the mop brush, notice that I'm holding it back at the very end of the brush, and I am just barely letting the tips of the brush barely touch the canvas. If you are picking up a lot of paint on your mop brush, you know that you're pushing too hard. And that's something that takes a little getting used to. So I'm rinsing my brush off in the water now. I'm going to pull some more of the Dioxazine Purple, and I'm just going to let that blend right into that magenta. Now because my brush has a little bit of water, anywhere where the magenta might have started to dry just a little. It wasn't actually dry, it's just getting there. That is kind of reactivating by adding the water. I don't know if that's the best way to word it, because it's not like when I used the Winsor & Newton pigment markers where those really reactivate when dry. It's just that it was starting to get a little tacky, not quite dry yet. And I'm making sure that any brush strokes I have are going in the direction that I would want them to if they were clouds or something like that. So I can let that texture work for me. But again, even if there are brush strokes, does not really matter on this piece because of the way that we're painting it and what we're painting. Softening that out with the brush. Now I don't have to blend everything with the mop brush. That's something that I've seen a lot of artists new to blending with that brush do, is they feel like they have to take the mop brush to everything. You don't. And the mop brush is only going to work if you are blending wet into wet. If you are blending wet into a dry area, that's not the brush. That won't work. Then you would switch over to a stiffer brush to blend those two areas together. But here, this entire canvas is wet while I'm working on it, and so the mop brush is the way to go. Now that mop brush is actually a makeup brush. They do not shed as bad as art brushes. Why? I can't tell you. I don't understand why they can't make a good art brush that doesn't shed. I think if I ever get audited, the tax people are going to be like, why are you writing off makeup brushes? But these makeup brushes really work well. The thing you want to watch for if you're buying a makeup brush to use as a mop brush is you want something that's very light, has a lightweight handle, as long of a handle as you can get, and very lightweight. I don't know why I'm fussing over this brush stroke at the bottom, because that's all going to get covered with black later anyway. So with the mop brush, I'm only dipping the very tip of those bristles into the water, and I'm working it in circles on my paper towel to dry it off. I want to make sure this is completely dry before I do anything else. I want this brush ready to go, so the next time I want to blend, that brush is dry and ready. If that brush is wet, it won't work. If the brush has paint on it, it won't work. So it's one of those things, as soon as I'm done with whatever area I just blended, my first thing is to rinse just the tip. I don't want to get the whole thing wet because it'll take too long to dry. But if I rinse just the very tips, and that's all that you should have paint on, and then dry it right away, it's ready to go. So So the next thing I'm going to do is use the hairdryer and dry this. Now with the hairdryer, it looks like I've got it closer than I actually do. When you watch these videos, it's about a foot away at least from the canvas. You don't really want to go too close because you can cause the paint, if it gets too hot, the acrylic paint can sort of bubble. That's something that I've really only seen with the what are they called? The embossing guns. Those will really cause some problems because it really overheats. But these, with the normal hairdryer, I use it on high heat, high power, and I just keep it so that it's not too close to my actual canvas. Now, one thing that I've seen people complain about with acrylics is that they dry more dull than they were when they're wet. Well, yes, but once you put a glaze over it, or I'm sorry, not a glaze, when you put your gloss varnish over it, that will pull all your colors back to what they were while you were painting. That's the reason. It's just that these paints, especially with the Liquitex Basics, they dry matte, which makes them feel like they're a little bit more dull. And I choose that for a reason because the matte, the tracing and transfer paper method, gosh, too early, my brain keeps shutting down. The tracing and transfer paper method or drawing my subject on with a white charcoal pencil won't work if I'm working with a gloss paint. You can get gloss, high gloss acrylics that stay that vivid color as you're painting. I don't like that. I want the flat so that I can, it just works better for layering, for airbrushing, for all of the techniques I do. I love the finish that the Liquitex Basics have. I just wish they came in more colors. But with that, all I have to do is put my glaze or my high gloss varnish over it and the colors come out super, super bold. And I'll have a video showing you how I glaze, what I use in the video description. For this next part, I am using a very stiff, it's actually somewhat damaged brush. This is a round, and I'm taking a little bit of water in with my white paint and a palette knife, and I'm flicking. I'm pulling the palette knife towards me. If you pull it away, you'll flick yourself in the face with paint. And I'm creating stars. Now, I do this in 2 layers. I'm still going to glaze color over this, but I like to create 2 layers so I have at least 2 colors of stars. But I don't have to actually mix 2 different colors of stars. I can just flick 1 layer with white. When that dries, I will paint over it, and those stars will still show. They'll be subtle, so it feels like you've got more depth in the piece, like you have stars that are much farther away because they're toned down. Now that brush, once it gets wet, it doesn't work very well. You want that brush to be pretty stiff. And one thing that a lot of artists like to do is use a toothbrush because they hold their stiffness, that shape, a lot better. I'll have to do a video doing that too. I'm just too lazy to get up and get one, and that brush was sitting right next to me. But you can use a toothbrush and just use your finger to flick, pull your finger towards you so the paint flicks away from you. That's another way to go. So I'm taking this filbert. This is a Taklon bristled filbert. Mixing some white there. Got a decent amount of water. And apparently going to change my mind. Okay, so here's the next thing that I'm doing. I want to create texture in that galaxy. So I've taken a plastic bag. You can use, this one's a Ziploc bag. You can use a shopping bag. I've pulled up some of the white paint that I had previously mixed out with a bit of water. Now I'm taking a wet flat brush and just softening that out. I just want to create a bit of texture, and there are 800 different ways you can get a similar look, but this is the one that I'm doing for this video because it's pretty easy. Actually, most of them are pretty easy. But see how I'm just kind of dabbing, spreading that out a little bit? I just want to start creating some of that texture. Now I did have to make sure that my previous stars were completely dry, otherwise I'm just going to blend them out. And that's the big thing when you're working with acrylics, the way that we layer. Just make sure your previous layers were dry and you can paint over them, as long as you're using good paint. So creating a little bit of a pattern here. Now if you have an airbrush, you can use different templates or stencils that are great and very fast for creating very realistic looking galaxies. That's what I typically would use, but with this one I wanted to keep it basic so that you don't need a lot of supplies. So if anybody is new to acrylics, just wants to try something out, this is a fairly minimalistic painting as far as supplies go. Actually, I guess the end result is fairly minimalistic as well. So I'm just kind of smudging that out. Now it looks a little foggy because I used white. Anytime you use titanium white and you're blending it out like that, it ends up foggy, but that's okay because I'm going to glaze color over that. And I can repeat this process as much as I want just to create some texture there on the center portion of the galaxy. And I think that shopping bags, plastic shopping bags, work better. I just don't have any. So this was kind of my alternative. You see how I'm just softening that out because I didn't want it to be too harsh. You can leave it harsh if you want. It'll tone down when you glaze. It just depends on the look that you want. going to use the brush and just dab some in there, give it a little bit more form. Rinsing that brush. Now see how I've got that brush sitting in the water? Don't do that. That is how you ruin your brushes. Rinse it out and take it out. Now I did dab that brush on a paper towel. I didn't go straight from the water onto the canvas. That would be too much water. That's one thing you're really not seeing on this video is how often I touch the brush to a paper towel before I hit the canvas. But having the water on there, look at this form that I'm getting. Now if I just left this white, it would be really plain. It would just look like white paint slapped on top of the color that's already there. Watch what'll happen though once I get to the glazing stage. I've got to dry that completely first. Rinsing this brush off because it was actually, I had loaded paint on it and forgot about it. Make sure you rinse your brushes. That is a quick way. If you leave it sitting to the side, especially if you're used to oil painting, it's really easy to set it to the side thinking, oh, it'll be fine for a few minutes. It's not. Rinse it right away. So what I'm doing is I'm mixing water in with my yellow. And again, I've dabbed this on a paper towel, which you're not seeing in the video. And I'm glazing that color. There is no white. When I do the glazing, there's no white. If you mix white in with your glaze, you end up with a foggy, ugly mess. I just want the actual pigment. So I'm taking water and mixing that in with whatever color I want. And just brushing that onto the canvas, tinting the color, making it more bold. And this is another area, because of what I'm painting here, if my brush strokes show from the glaze, does not matter at all. No one's really going to notice that because you would have texture here anyway. You can do this same thing where every single brush stroke you paint shows and it'll still look awesome. I think that's why this is just such a good project because it's so forgiving. I mean, even if you look at the upper left-hand corner, look at the purple where it's a bit darker and you can kind of see the zigzag coming in that upper corner with the darker purple and the lighter purple. It's all the same purple. It was just thicker in the center portion, so that's why it looks darker. It doesn't matter. It does not matter at all for this. That's something that if I was doing a different type of sky, then I would worry about that. But for this, it won't matter in the end. So you can have things go terribly wrong and it's okay. So what I'm doing here is taking a brush and smudging this out. My paint is drying too quickly. So I've taken a stiff brush, a stiff round brush, and there's a little bit of water on it. It's just slightly damp and it helps it to blend out softly. If I start getting those rough edges, I can smooth that out with that brush. I can also add a little bit of water to the brush I'm currently using and that will help. The problem is that you have to, when you add water like that, it can be hard to balance out how much water versus too much water. If you get too much water, it just creates way more problems. So you've got to be careful, and that just comes, it's not like there's a magic formula. You have to balance out how much water on one brush versus the other, and that comes from practice. The more you paint, the more this will just start making sense to you. It's not like there's going to be some, magic formula like there would be with math that you just learn the formula and you're good. With art, you have to kind of feel it. You're just going to get a feel for that, and that comes from practice. So there was that stiff round brush that's slightly wet, and I just kind of smudged that out a little bit. And that magenta color that I have there, again, that is my red mixed with my Dioxazine Purple. And you don't have to use these exact colors. It doesn't matter. Use whatever colors you want. It does make it easier, though, if you don't use too many colors. If you get to where you're trying to combine too many things at once, it can get a little overwhelming and it's really easy to create a muddy mess. Now this painting you can leave as a sky alone. You don't have to add the silhouettes that I'm going to add later. There's so many options. You could add different types of trees. You could have houses or buildings. A cityscape with just a silhouette of tall buildings would be beautiful. You could have a wave crashing forward. There are so many options that you could do with this. If you do paint this, I would love to see what you guys create. You can post them here on Patreon or share in one of our art groups. Now these colors that I'm using, everything except white is really translucent. So you're going to see the brush strokes beneath them. You can still see the stars beneath this because of them being translucent. That's, a lot of people will complain about that. They don't like that they're not more opaque. Having translucent paints is actually better. I know that my Mars Black and my Titanium White are my opaque colors. There's a few other colors that are fairly opaque, but you want that transparency because as you build layers like this is what's going to create the depth. If you only use opaque colors, you will not get the depth that you can by layering several translucent colors. Now, of course, some colors are going to be more translucent than we like. I've used cheap acrylics that were just terrible. They were way too translucent, but I do like that about these paints. I'm going to create a little bit more form here. Just dabbing that out with that stiff round brush. And that stiff round brush it's just barely damp. There's a little bit of water, not much. And the nice thing with this, play with it. If something looks terrible, you have a layer and you're like, oh my gosh, I ruined it, it's all messed up, put another layer over it until it looks good. Rinsing that brush out. Now, one thing I do want to recommend, you try to break the habit of, and I think we all have this habit, we rinse out a brush or we have water on it, we want to get a little bit more water and mix in with our paint, but there's already paint on the brush, and we take that paint covered brush and wipe it along the edge of our water well. Don't do that. You end up with paint all over the edge, which ends up all over the handle of the brush when you put your brush in there to rinse, and then that ends up on your hands, which ends up on the canvas. It makes a horrible mess. Instead, rinse the brush and wipe it off on a paper towel, but don't scrape the edge of paint, wet paint, on the edge of your water well. That's a habit that you really want to break. It makes painting very messy. And for paper towels, you'll often hear me say that I like Viva paper towels, but that's only for oil painting or when I'm using colored pencils. When I'm using the odorless mineral spirits, I'll want a Viva paper towel. Otherwise, I just want regular Bounty, or I think that's what I have, Bounty. Regular, less expensive paper towels is better for acrylic. The Viva doesn't absorb water right, which is what makes them so perfect for oil. So here, again, just kind of forming this shape, I'm just pulling down the brush strokes a little bit with that stiff round brush. Now this would be a case where I've often seen students try to use that mop brush to blend like what I'm doing with that stiff brush. It won't work because I'm blending wet paint over dry paint. That only works for wet into wet. Here, wet over dry, I switch over to that stiff round. And those stiff round brushes, they work better, or I like them better when they start to get a little damaged over time. So at first they tend to be a little bit floppy, but the more you use them, they definitely start to stiffen up. I just intentionally, when they're new, I don't do a good job of rinsing them out. I let a little bit of paint, not globs of paint, but it's just not perfectly rinsed out, and that works really well for me. So rinsing those brushes out. Now, I tried using that same brush. I rinsed it out and dried it as good as I could, and I tried to use that to flick stars. Didn't work. It was too floppy. It was too wet. And so see how it's just kind of bending? It's not flicking paint the way I need. Nothing's really happening there. So I gave up on that. Let's just rinse that brush out, and I'm going to grab a dry brush. And if you're using a toothbrush, that's not really a problem because they do hold their shape better. The bristles are shorter. That when they're wet, it doesn't really matter. So grabbing a new one from under my easel, and there's my big head. So I want it a little damp. I did add a little bit of water, but I don't want it soaking wet like the other one was. And now look how great this one, big drops. And I don't recommend trying to take a liner brush and dot in every individual star. It looks very unnatural, very fake. If you want this to look realistic, you want to flick the paint. You can control the location to an extent. You can see how I'm really focusing on the center. And I want some to be bigger drops and some to be smaller drops of the white in order to make the stars look realistic. And when you dab it with a paintbrush, with a liner brush, it takes so long. And I used to do this. It ended up not looking so hot. Mostly just because everything would be so uniform. You don't want uniformity here. Like everything with nature, you want that variation. And the great thing is you're naturally, when you flick the paint like this, you're going to have clumps and clusters of paint that just naturally form. So you have those star clusters, which again, go back to looking very realistic. When I used the lighter brush and sat there and dotted everything, I had a tendency to come up too even. Sure, I might cluster 3 or 4 stars, but for the most part, everything ended up too even, too uniform. And the funny thing is, it used to take me so long to do that. Look how fast this was just to flick the stars on there and how much more realistic it looks. So I've got to make sure that's dried really well. I don't want to smudge these white bits when I go over and start painting the black, the palm trees. When you paint silhouettes, you can go super simple like I do here, or you can make it have them have shadows and highlights. I mean, there's a lot you can do with silhouettes. Tons of options. For this one, I'm keeping it very, very simple. And what I'm going to do is first block in where the ground is. Being that these are palm trees, I'm going to get these kind of tropical Hawaiian shaped mountains. Yes, Hawaiian shaped. I have apparently made up another term. But they're bumpy. They're not totally uniformed is the point there. Now the edges, look how I'm dabbing this, because even though I'll have palm trees sticking out over this, I don't want a perfectly smooth line for where the mountains are. That won't look right. So I want to create the effect of kind of bushes and trees that are smaller and down below where the palm trees are going to stick out. Then I will just fill this in solid. This is a Taklon bristled filbert, one of the soft grip brushes. These are a pretty nice, I like these brushes. You can get them if you look up, I want to say it's Royal Soft Grip. Those are fairly inexpensive and they work really well. They used to be carried by Michaels. Most of their brushes were these ones years ago. And now they might have a few, but I don't see full sets like I used to, or, you know, big displays of them like I used to. But you can still get them online. Wow, I probably should have left it there. Look how cool that would have looked if I left water, like there was a pond down below. I kind of wish I would have left that. And all that was the sky showing through. It looked like the reflection of the stars on it. That would have made for a better piece. Didn't even notice it till watching that now. Oh well. Maybe next time. I want to do one of these as a live stream and have you guys paint along with me. So maybe we'll leave that water little pond down below next time. So I'm rinsing that out, putting that brush to the side. Notice that I leave them laying flat. You don't want to leave them, you can see the water well that I'm using. It's got the holes on the side. The intent for that is that you can stick your brushes, the end of them, in them, and it'll stick up. The problem is then water, if your brush is wet, water will run down into the area that glue is holding those bristles in place, and it can make your brushes not last as long. So when you use your brushes, you just want to rinse them out, set them to the side. You can dry them on a paper towel if you want, but just set them laying flat, not upright. You don't want them upright or down the other way either, where that would damage the tips of the bristles. So I'm going to start by drawing in the trunks of some of these trees. Notice the base will be a little bit thicker and they get thinner as I move towards the end of the tree. And the way that I'm doing that is I just push harder at the base and then I lift the brush away from the canvas as I get out towards the end, and that will create the thinner line. The harder you push, the thicker your line is going to be. Adding less pressure will create a thinner line. I'm just going to use the same. This one is I want to say this is a something Simmons, a Taklon bristled round brush. Now, if you're more comfortable using an actual liner brush, like a number 2 or a number 3, go for it. For this stage, this is just from practice. I'm used to using these, so I can use a very light hand and get thin lines. But if you're a beginner, it's probably going to be a lot easier for you to use a liner brush. I like to use the same brush for as many things as I can, mostly because it's just a lazy habit. If I can get the same brush to do the same thing as another one, why switch? So that's what I'm doing here. But again, I do think it would be a lot easier for most people to switch to a liner brush for that stage. And here I will switch to a liner brush. I need to rinse that brush first. Set that to the side. So I'm using a little bit of water mixed in with the black paint and just kind of swirling that into the liner brush. And I'm going to create the little hairs coming off of each of these lines that I previously painted on there. Notice I'm pulling from the large line and just pulling down, making those palm fronds. I love painting palm trees because they are so easy to make them look really cool. The big thing with these, I like the sort of wispier palm trees more so than the ones with the very stiff palm fronds. So you can see I've got all of my lines are slightly curved. I'm not making straight lines coming out of any of these. In this one, you want to watch how you're doing this too. You don't want it to look almost like a star where everything is evenly coming out of the center. Look at how each of these palm leaves, they curve. The ones towards the back are curved more or shorter as they stick up towards the center where it looks like it's kind of aiming the other direction. Don't try to make all of these the same going all the way around to where it's almost flowered. Make sure you're getting variation. These are really good practice. If you do not feel comfortable with a liner brush, paint palm trees. You'll get good with that liner brush pretty quickly. They're just so easy, even if it's on a scratch piece of canvas or a canvas pad. Notice that there's no chunks of paint on the tip of this brush. I've mixed in a little bit of water. I twisted the brush into my black paint, and it's pretty evenly covering the front half of this paintbrush. I don't want big, thick clumps, otherwise I'm not going to get thin lines. I remember when I first started with using a liner brush, thinking there had to be some special brush. I was doing it wrong, that I'm not getting thin lines. And really it was just how I was holding the brush, how I was loading paint on the brush, and it comes with practice. But the big thing is you don't want thick paint, you don't want thick clumps of paint. I'm thinning this out quite a bit with water so that it flows smoothly. And of course, too much water won't work either. You've got to play around with that until you get the hang of how much water versus how much paint. But you will want water mixed in with the paint in order for this to work right. And if you're someone who likes to use glazing medium instead of water, I don't like that for fine detail. It's too thick and clumpy and it makes it hard to get the small detail. So even if I've been using a lot of the glazing medium for different things, when I get to the little detail, I tend to depend more on water versus glazing medium for the little teeny details, just to thin that paint out a bit more. See how each of these little lines is somewhat curved? Now, it won't be practical to always have my palette recorded so you guys can see what I'm doing, but I do want to do that a bit more often. Let me know if that's helpful for you. Maybe even if it's just a clip here and there so you can really see what I'm doing. But for longer videos, I don't think my computer can handle the 2 film clips. So, well, I'll have to play around with that and find out. But let me know if that's something that's helpful for you guys, if it's something I should even bother playing with. And I'll make a few of these little palm fronds stick up from the mountain base too, just so that it looks more realistic. And there is my finished piece. You can see, depending on the lighting, the purple is going to be much darker or much lighter. It just depends on what area of the room that I'm in. There will be a lot of variation there, but that is it. And again, this is something that is so easy. It's very fast. It took me less than a half an hour start to finish to paint. So it's just such a great project if you're just getting started with acrylics, or if you just want a cool background for something else in acrylics that you're painting. And I will list all of the colors that I used in the description. So if you wanted to paint this one and pick up the actual colors I used, that information will be there for you. But like I said, you don't have to go with the exact colors. You can just follow the brush strokes that I'm making where the lights or darks are, and you'll get something that's very similar. And I will attach a large version of my painting so you can see it a little bit closer. If this is something that you want to paint and want to copy exactly, that will be there for you. It's going to be attached to this post.